A review's found the BBC breached its own editorial guidelines over a Gaza documentary narrated by the son of a Hamas official. Today, on The Daily, we are asking who at the BBC now takes responsibility.
Travis fell in love with the perfect woman. She listened. She cared. There was just one catch. She wasn't human. She was an AI companion. But when her behaviour takes a disturbing turn, Travis finds himself at the centre of a much darker story. This is Flesh and Code, a true story of love, loss, and the dangerous temptations of technology. Listen to Flesh and Code wherever you get your podcasts.
Mistakes were made. We're sorry and take full responsibility. Lessons will be learned. If that all sounds vaguely familiar, well, it has been the BBC response to pretty much every scandal that's hit them in the past decade. The latest, the documentary, Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. Now, soon after it was transmitted, several months ago now in fact, the BBC ended up apologising and launching the almost inevitable review. That has now concluded the Beeb did breach their editorial guidelines. And it just so happens the report's been released on the very same day as another review, that one into the former MasterChef host Greg Wallace. Look, a little later, we do have a former Conservative Culture Secretary. He'll be giving his views on the current Minister, Lisa Nandy's handling of the BBC. But let's start down at the broadcaster's London HQ. Katie Spencer is our arts and media correspondent. She's outside New Broadcasting House. Katie, look, the documentary itself was released back in February, some time ago, in fact. So what was it all about?
This was a portrayal of what it's like for three young children within Gaza, the perspective of those young lives of the people at the heart of it. And obviously for the BBC, there's so much pressure on them to really give an insightful account of what's going on in Gaza. So people were really keen to watch this.
But there was a problem with it, and the problem related to its narrator.
Yeah, it emerged actually that its narrator was the son of a Hamas minister. Now, the BBC then, because trust and transparency is at the heart of everything that it does, it immediately then reacted by pulling the documentary off of the iPlayer and caused this huge controversy. And in doing so, it garnered criticism from both sides.
So the BBC has launched a review. What has that concluded?
The findings has basically been that the BBC breached its editorial guidelines on accuracy. But what it has said, though, this report, is that nobody at the BBC knew of the father's position when it first aired in February. However, three of the people at the independent production company that produced the film were aware. So what this report basically finds is that the lion's share of the responsibility really is for the production company. But they didn't deliberately mislead the BBC, if you like. And the BBC, because trust and transparency is at the heart of everything that the corporation does, it has issued an apology. The Director General, Tim Davie, he admits there has been a significant failing, and he's basically pledged that the corporation would take action now to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
Katie, in this review, in this internal review, do we get any closer to understanding what the failures were, where the problem was that meant that the BBC was unaware of who was narrating a commission that they had made?
Well, look, if you talk to the Culture Secretary, if you were to listen to what she said in the Commons last week, she was very damning about the Director General, Tim Davie, saying, given what's happened in the wake of Glastonbury and the death chants that we heard, given the inquiry that they've had into this documentary, and given to what's happened with Greg Wallace as well. Last week in the Commons, she was very much saying, look, this points to a failure in leadership at the very top. But today, I would say, actually, we've heard a different side to the Culture Secretary, who's spoken about the fact that she believes that she's certainly heard the right noises being made from the management in there, that they are seemingly determined that this sort of thing won't be allowed to happen again.
But they always do seem to be on the back foot. And again, we're talking Gaza documentary today, but we're also talking Greg Wallace.
Yes, we've just had at the time of this recording, we've just had his statement come out. His argument seems to sort of stem back to it being cancel culture once again, that he was sort of hired as this cheeky greengrocer, but there's some sort of working class conspiracy almost, is his argument, to sort of keep him off the TV, which he says is a dangerous trend almost of the BBC that he's said he's worried about.
So just remind us again, what did the report into Wallace say?
Yeah, look, they did a thorough job. This wasn't the BBC that did the investigation. It was by lawyers hired by Banerjee. Then they had evidence from 78 witnesses. It says they interviewed Greg Wallace for over 14 hours, and they've had 45 complaints substantiated. So that's 12 that claims that he made inappropriate jokes and inappropriate innuendo, 16 reports that he made sexually explicit comments, 2 allegations that he made sexualized comments about someone, 4 complaints he made culturally insensitive or racist comments, 3 claims he was in a state of undress. Can you imagine, in sort of any work setting? 7 allegations of bullying, 1 allegation of unwanted touching. And actually in Greg's statement that he's put out today, he's tried to challenge that allegation of unwanted touching, and he's had to come to the acknowledgement that there's a disagreement in terms of how that incident is viewed.
And look, at a time like this, with such significant failures, you might well expect to see a head on a pike outside New Broadcasting House. And I'm casting my eye over my shoulder, and so far I see none. Who is responsible? Who is taking the fall for this?
I can't see any heads around here at the moment. It's a very strange situation. I think we often come and cover these stories thinking, well, if it was us that were sort of caught in this hot water like this, then we would expect a good grilling from our competitors, and we would expect someone to sort of come out and accept responsibility for this. The BBC is hugely frustrating in terms of me covering this from a media point of view, because invariably when it is someone coming out to talk to the media, they don't come and talk to us, they talk to the World at One or one of their own programmes. So it is basically quite hard to actually get anyone from the BBC to talk to outside journalists and go on the record and sort of accept one-on-one questions. Interestingly, do you know what? We're approaching the day before their annual report is about to be released. If you cast your mind back to a year ago, the annual report last year was dominated by all of us journalists wanting to talk to the Director General and the BBC Chair about Hugh Edwards and the Hugh Edwards scandal. So once again, I think this year's BBC annual report, there might be lots of other things that we should be getting into, but again, it is the only opportunity for outside journalists to actually put questions to the top bosses, because it's so hard to get hold of anyone who wants to do an interview with us on camera.
Thanks, Katie. So, an awful lot for the Director General to consider. So too the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy. And one man who knows what it's like to be in the job at a time of crisis at the BBC is Sir John Whittingdale, former Conservative Culture Secretary, 2015 to 2016. John, this Gaza documentary, the Greg Wallace saga, I mean, what to you is the BBC's problem? Is it just accountability?
Well, the BBC is responsible for a huge amount of output across all its television, radio, internet, etc. And inevitably, things go wrong. I mean, I've been dealing with the BBC for probably 20 years now. So I was chair of a Culture Select Committee when we were summoning in the Director General then about the Jimmy Savile exposés, about the accusations against Lord McAlpine. We then had the Jonathan Ross Russell Brand, and it's been ongoing, through Martin Bashir, Hugh Edwards, and now, of course, Greg Wallace and the Gaza. So to some extent, given the amount that the BBC does, things will always go wrong. But what worries me is that every time this happens, the BBC sets up an inquiry, produces an independent report, says lessons have been learnt, measures have been put in place to ensure that it can't happen again. And then, of course, a few months later, something else happens. So it just seems unending, and that is a matter of concern.
But given that both MasterChef and the documentary were produced by independent production houses, does that not take some of the blame away from Auntie?
Obviously, the independent production houses had a responsibility, but at the end of the day, the liability rests with the BBC. I mean, I was in favour, and in the last charter, pressed the BBC to do more in terms of commissioning content from outside. But that doesn't mean that they can relax their own editorial controls. If something is screened or broadcast or on the BBC, then it is the BBC that carries the responsibility, and therefore they need to be very certain that the checks are made against all content, whether it's made in-house or by an outside independent production house.
OK, John, so where exactly does responsibility lie?
Well, the DG ultimately has overall responsibility. I've always thought that actually the two responsibilities that that office carries, one of which is to manage and run the BBC, which obviously is a huge organization of billions, and alongside that, you have the task of being, well, the title is editor in chief, and therefore you have overall responsibility for everything that is broadcast. Now, it is arguable that both of those jobs are big enough for, to be full time, and to try and do two simultaneously is just too much for any one person. And that's perhaps something that needs to be looked at renewal. It's something that I did consider before the BBC didn't want to separate it, but since then we continue to have these failures, and it simply is not capable for one person to carry on all those different roles.
Is there perhaps a simple and even elegant solution to all of this? If, as you say, these incidents are inevitable given the scale of what the BBC does, shouldn't the BBC be doing less?
Well, I think that's a separate issue, and it's one where I have a lot of sympathy. I mean, I think that the world has changed so much in terms of the amount of content that is available across a wide range of different platforms. So, you've got all the new streaming services like Disney and Amazon and Netflix and Apple and Sky, indeed, that produces a lot of excellent content. The time when the BBC was, just one of two or three broadcasters, that the world has completely changed. And yet the BBC don't seem to be withdrawing from anything. If anything, they're doing more. They're launching new radio stations most recently. And I do think that there is perhaps a case for the BBC to reconsider, all that they do against all the alternative sources available, and to perhaps focus more on the stuff that only the BBC can do, or only the BBC is really good at.
But when it comes to those areas that we think of as core to the BBC, news, current affairs, I mean, we have seen the BBC misstepping. We have seen the BBC lacking confidence, particularly when it comes to coverage of issues around the Middle East. And on the issue of that documentary, that the BBC were unaware before transmission that narrator was directly related to a minister in the Hamas government. I mean, there are failures, and then there's this.
I agree. It is a clear failure. And, it wasn't exactly hard to discover if a proper due diligence had been carried out. But equally, we had another failure by the BBC just a couple of weeks ago, again related to the Middle East, which was the broadcast from Glastonbury, where you'd also have thought that actually it didn't take much to guess that this was a performer who, had a history of extreme politically controversial remarks. And yet nobody seemed to have said, well, we better watch this carefully and, have the off switch on standby should anything be said. And that is what worries me. It is the fact that the BBC don't appear on both of these occasions and many others either to have anticipated or to have reacted fast enough when problems have arisen.
Talk to me a little bit about your time at Culture and as Secretary of State. I mean, what is the nature of the relationship between the person who in government has oversight of these issues but is hands off when it comes to the running of the thing, and the person who actually is in there doing the day job?
Well, it's a difficult balancing act because obviously the government funds the BBC, owns the BBC, or at least the state owns the BBC, and ultimately is responsible. But on the other hand, editorial independence is a critical factor, and the government has rightly said that they cannot interfere with editorial judgments. Now, I mean, I've had several roles. Not only was I Secretary of State before that, I was chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and I did that for 10 years, during which we used to call in the BBC Director General on a regular basis, both to sort of continue to monitor the BBC, but also when something went wrong. So, when the Russell Brand, Jonathan Ross interview took place, we had the BBC's Director General in front of the committee within 24 hours. And that is something that the BBC needs to be held to account in public for failures, because ultimately the public pays for the BBC and the public is entitled to know that big people are held account when mistakes are made.
But when those mistakes keep being made, when these incidents keep cropping up, is that arm's length relationship between the people who run the country and the people who run the BBC, is that tenable in the longer term, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it is. An arm's length relationship doesn't mean that there is no relationship. It means that the Secretary of State, who is ultimately responsible, needs to not directly try and tell the BBC what they can broadcast or what they can't broadcast. I do accept that, but there will always be occasions when the government expresses a pretty strong view if they think the BBC is getting it wrong. So there are some things the BBC does which we really need to continue to support. But as we're coming up to charter renewal now, I think it is fair to say, the BBC already costs £175 a year to every household. Does it need to go on doing all that it does? And is that the right way of paying for it? And that, I think, is another issue which is very much coming to the top of the agenda.
So, John Whittingdale, thank you. And you can read Katie's analysis of yet another dark day at the BBC over on the website or the app. The Sky News Daily is back again tomorrow.
Travis fell in love with the perfect woman. She listened. She cared. There was just one catch. She wasn't human. She was an AI companion. But when her behaviour takes a disturbing turn, Travis finds himself at the centre of a much darker story. This is Flesh and Code, a true story of love, loss, and the dangerous temptations of technology. Listen to Flesh and Code wherever you get your podcasts.